Her drunk father sold her at the saloon, but a quiet rancher saw more than her chains. The amber liquid sloshed against the grimy glass as Frank Calloway's trembling hand reached for another drink. The Red Horse Saloon reeked of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies and broken dreams, a perfect mirror for the man who'd stumbled through its bat-wing doors 3 hours earlier. Outside, the Wyoming Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Bitter Creek, a town that existed solely because the railroad needed water and the railroad men needed whiskey. "I ain't got no more credit, Frank," Big Jim Morrison growled from behind the scarred mahogany bar. His massive frame cast a shadow over the desperate man slumped on the stool. "You owe me near $40 already." Frank's bloodshot eyes darted around the dimly lit interior, past the poker tables where hardened men played with money they couldn't afford to lose, past the painted women who smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes. His gaze settled on his daughter, Clara, who sat rigidly in the corner, her calloused hands folded in her lap like a prayer. At 19, Clara Calloway possessed the kind of beauty that made men stop talking when she walked by. Auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper, green eyes that held depths of intelligence her circumstances had never allowed her to explore, and a bearing that suggested nobility despite her threadbare dress. She'd been working at the Red Horse for 6 months now, serving drinks and dodging wandering hands, all to keep her father from drinking himself to death on the streets. "Your girl's been mighty helpful around here," Big Jim continued, his voice taking on a calculating tone that made Clara's stomach clench. "Men seem to like her serving their drinks. Course some of them been asking if she might be available for other services." "She ain't that kind of girl," Frank mumbled, but his conviction wavered like a candle in the wind. Big Jim leaned forward, his breath heavy with cigar smoke and rotgut whiskey. "Tell you what, Frank, I'll wipe your debt clean and give you another $50 on top. All you gotta do is sign this here paper saying Clara works for me now, exclusive-like." The contract, if the crude document could be called that, lay between them like a snake ready to strike. Clara felt the walls of the saloon closing in around her. She'd watched this scene play out before with other desperate fathers and their daughters. Once Big Jim owned you, you became part of his collection of broken dolls, dancing to whatever tune the paying customers wanted to hear. "Papa, please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the tinkling piano in the corner. "We'll find another way. I can take in more sewing, maybe work at the hotel." "Shut your mouth, girl," Frank snapped, but there were tears in his eyes. The war had taken his leg, the bank had taken his farm, and the bottle had taken everything else. All he had left was the one thing every man in this godforsaken town wanted. Big Jim's making us a fair offer. Clara knew better than to argue further. Her father's pride was already hanging by a thread, and she wouldn't be the one to cut it. She'd learned long ago that sometimes survival meant swallowing your dignity whole. Through the dusty window, she caught sight of a lone rider approaching the saloon. He sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. Even from a distance, there was something different about him, a quietness that spoke of confidence rather than defeat, a purposefulness that seemed foreign in a town where most men drifted like tumbleweeds. "That's Thomas McKenna," Big Jim muttered, following her gaze. "Owns the Circle M ranch about 20 miles north, keeps to himself mostly, but his money spends just fine." As the rider dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, Clara found herself holding her breath. Something about the stranger stirred a feeling she'd almost forgotten: hope. Perhaps it was the way he moved with deliberate grace, or how he tipped his hat respectfully to the women on the boardwalk, but for a moment she allowed herself to imagine that not all men were cut from the same selfish cloth. Frank's shaking hand reached for the pen. "I'm sorry, Clara. God help me. I'm so sorry." The scratch of the pen against paper sounded like a death knell in the suddenly quiet saloon. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, tried to recall the prayers they used to say together before consumption took her 5 years ago. but all she could hear was the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of feet as men began to circle closer, sensing fresh prey. The bat-wing doors swung open with a soft creak, and Thomas McKenna stepped inside. Thomas McKenna had been riding hard for 3 days, chasing rustlers who'd made off with 20 head of his best cattle. The trail had gone cold just outside Bitter Creek, leaving him with nothing but dust in his throat and frustration gnawing at his gut. At 32, he'd learned that life rarely handed out easy victories, but he'd also learned that sometimes the best thing you could do was step back and reassess the situation. The Red Horse Saloon wasn't his usual choice for refreshment, but his horse needed water and he needed information. Small towns like Bitter Creek survived on gossip, and if his cattle had passed through, someone would have noticed. The moment he stepped inside, Thomas felt the familiar weight of scrutiny that followed him wherever he went. In a territory where most men wore their histories on their sleeves, Confederate gray or Union blue, railroad money or cattle money, winner or loser, Thomas McKenna remained an enigma. He'd arrived in Wyoming 5 years ago with enough gold to buy the Circle M Ranch outright, but no one knew where the money had come from or what he'd left behind. What struck him immediately wasn't the usual cast of characters that populated frontier saloons, but the young woman sitting in the corner like a bird in a cage. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was something else that caught his attention, a dignity that seemed to shine through despite her circumstances, a strength that reminded him of the wild horses he'd learned to gentle rather than break. "Well, well," Big Jim Morrison's voice boomed across the room. "Thomas McKenna graces us with his presence. What brings the mysterious rancher to our humble establishment?" Thomas approached the bar with measured steps, his spurs chiming softly against the worn wooden floor. "Looking for information about some missing cattle. Thought someone might have seen them pass through." "Cattle rustling's been a problem lately," Big Jim agreed, pouring a whiskey without being asked. "But tonight, we're celebrating a different kind of business transaction." Thomas's eyes flicked to the corner where the young woman, Clara, he'd heard someone call her, sat frozen, like a deer sensing danger. Her father, a broken-down man with the shakes, was stuffing money into his pockets with hands that couldn't seem to move fast enough. "Congratulations are in order," Big Jim continued, his voice dripping with false joviality. "Frank here just made his daughter part of our little family. Clara's going to be entertaining our guests on a more regular basis." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd seen plenty of hard choices in his time. During the war, men had sold everything they owned for a handful of beans or a dry place to sleep. But there was something about this particular transaction that made his blood run cold. Maybe it was the way Clara held herself, as if she were trying to disappear into the shadows, or maybe it was the look of absolute defeat in her father's eyes. "That's so," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several nearby conversations falter. Big Jim, either oblivious to the warning or too drunk on his own power to care, gestured grandly toward Clara. "Course, a man of your means might be interested in first rights, for the right price, naturally." The saloon fell silent except for the mechanical tinkling of the piano in the corner. Clara felt every eye in the room on her, appraising her like livestock at auction. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but years of survival had taught her when to stay still and when to move. This was a time for stillness. Thomas set his glass down with deliberate care, the small sound somehow more menacing than if he'd slammed it. "What's the price?" Big Jim's eyes lit up with greed. "Well now, for a man of your reputation, I'd say $200. For the whole night, of course. I'll give you 500. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Clara's head snapped up, her green eyes meeting Thomas's brown ones for the first time. What she saw there wasn't the hungry leer she'd expected, but something else entirely. A calm calculation that spoke of plans within plans. 500? Big Jim stammered, his composure cracking. Well, that is to say, for her papers, Thomas continued, his voice steady as granite. All of them. Whatever contract you have with her father, whatever debt he owes you, whatever claim you think you have on her, $500, and she walks out of here free and clear. The saloon erupted in murmurs and whispers. Frank Calloway looked up from his money, confusion clouding his already addled features. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, finally sensing an open door. Big Jim's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally, grudging respect. You don't even know her, McKenna. Why would you spend that kind of money on a girl you never met? Thomas pulled a leather pouch from his coat and began counting out gold coins, each one ringing against the bar like a bell tolling freedom. Let's just say I don't. Like seeing people caged when they ought to be flying. He looked directly at Clara then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not possession or desire, but recognition, as if he saw in her not what she'd been forced to become, but who she really was underneath it all. Miss Calloway, Thomas said formally, as if they were being introduced at a church social rather than in a frontier saloon. Would you care to accompany me? I believe this establishment has nothing more to offer either of us. Clara stood on unsteady legs, hardly daring to believe what was happening. For the first time in months, the future held something other than despair. The ride to the Circle M ranch passed in relative silence, punctuated only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara rode behind Thomas on his sturdy bay gelding, her arms wrapped carefully around his waist, close enough to feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing, but uncertain about everything else. She'd expected him to make demands, to claim what he'd paid for with the casual entitlement she'd grown accustomed to from men. Instead, he'd simply helped her onto his horse, tipped his hat to the stunned crowd in the saloon, and ridden out of Bitter Creek as if rescuing indentured women was something he did every Tuesday. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly around them, painted in shades of gold and amber by the setting sun. Rolling hills gave way to distant mountains that seemed to touch the sky, and Clara found herself breathing deeply for the first time in months. The air here was clean, untainted by the smoke and desperation that clung to Bitter Creek like a shroud. "You cold?" Thomas asked, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left town. "No, sir," Clara replied, though she was. The thin dress she wore was designed for indoor work, not riding across open country in the evening air. Without another word, Thomas reined in the horse and shrugged out of his leather jacket. "Put this on. It's going to get colder before we reach the ranch." Clara hesitated. In her experience, gifts from men always came with strings attached. "I don't want to be owing you more than I already do." Thomas turned in the saddle to look at her, his brown eyes serious. "Miss Calloway, let me make something clear. You don't owe me anything. What happened back there, that was me settling a debt with my own conscience, not creating one with you." She took the jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and sage, clean and honest scents that seemed to belong to this vast country. "Then why did you do it? You don't know me from Eve." "Maybe not," Thomas said, urging the horse forward again. "But I know what it looks like when someone's spirit is about to break, and I know what it feels like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control." There was something in his voice, a weight that spoke of personal experience, that made Clara study the back of his head more carefully. Thomas McKenna was a mystery in a land where most men's stories were written in their faces, and she found herself curious about what had brought him to Wyoming, what had given him the means to buy a ranch, and the wisdom to use his money for something other than his own pleasure. As they crested a hill, the Circle M ranch spread out below them like a promise. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch and smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a stable, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Everything spoke of prosperity earned through hard work rather than quick schemes. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed and meant it. "It's home," Thomas said simply, "or as close to one as I've managed to build." They rode into the yard as full darkness settled over the ranch. A figure emerged from the house, a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and a face that suggested she'd seen her share of frontier hardships. "Thomas McKenna, where have you been?" the woman called, her hands on her hips. "I expected you back yesterday, and here you come riding in with company and no explanation." "Evening, Martha," Thomas said, dismounting and then helping Clara down. "This is Miss Clara Calloway. She'll be staying with us for a while. Clara, this is Martha Henderson. She keeps the house running and keeps me in line, though I suspect the second job is harder than the first." Martha's sharp eyes took in Clara's appearance, the thin dress, the exhaustion in her face, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. Whatever she saw there seemed to pass some kind of test, because her expression softened. "Well, any friend of Thomas's is welcome here," Martha said briskly. "You look half-starved, child. Come inside and we'll get some food in you." The interior of the house surprised Clara with its warmth and comfort. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and the furniture, while simple, was well made and welcoming. Books lined the shelves, more books than Clara had seen since her mother died, and she found herself drawn to them like a moth to flame. "You read?" Thomas asked, noticing her interest. "When I can," Clara admitted. "My mother taught me before she passed." "Feel free to borrow any that catch your fancy," Thomas said. "Books are meant to be shared." Martha bustled around the kitchen, preparing a plate of beef stew and fresh bread that made Clara's mouth water. It had been days since she'd eaten anything more substantial than stale crackers and whatever scraps Big Jim had allowed her from the saloon's kitchen. "Now then," Martha said, setting the food in front of Clara, "what's your story, dear? And don't give me any pretty lies. I've got 5 sons and 3 daughters, and I can spot a tale from a mile away." Clara glanced at Thomas, uncertain how much to reveal. He nodded encouragingly, settling into a chair across from her. "My father, he had debts," Clara began carefully, "to the saloon owner in Bitter Creek. He couldn't pay, so he signed papers making me work for the man instead." Martha's face darkened. "That son of a—" She caught herself glancing apologetically at Clara. "Forgive my language, but I've got strong feelings about men who'd sell their own blood." "Thomas bought the papers," Clara continued, "paid the debt and brought me here. I still don't rightly understand why." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were seeing something that existed only in memory. "5 years ago, I was in a situation not too different from yours," he said finally. "Trapped by circumstances, owing debts I couldn't pay, with limited options and none of them good. Someone helped me then, gave me a chance to start over. I guess you could say I'm returning the favor." Clara wanted to ask more, to understand what had brought him to that place and who had helped him escape it, but something in his expression warned her off. Instead, she focused on the miracle of being warm, fed, and safe for the first time in months. "I'll work to earn my keep," she said firmly. "I can cook and clean and mend. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I'm sure you're not," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "But first, you're going to rest and get your strength back. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." As Martha showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom, Clara found herself overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. For months, she'd survived by expecting the worst from people, by preparing herself for disappointment and cruelty. The simple act of being treated with respect felt foreign and wonderful. That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets and a roof that didn't leak, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was what hope felt like. Fragile as spun glass, but bright enough to light the darkness. 3 weeks had passed since Clara arrived at the Circle M, and the transformation was remarkable. The hollow-eyed girl who'd sat trembling in the Red Horse Saloon had been replaced by a young woman with color in her cheeks and purpose in her step. She'd thrown herself into ranch life with a determination that impressed even Martha, who wasn't easily won over. Clara discovered she had a natural way with horses, spending hours in the corral with the gentler mares, brushing their coats and talking to them in low, soothing tones. Thomas often found himself watching her from the porch, marveling at how someone who'd been treated like property could show such patience and kindness to his livestock. "You're staring again," Martha observed, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Just keeping an eye on things," Thomas replied, but his ears reddened slightly. Martha settled into the rocking chair beside him. "That girl's been through hell, Thomas. She's like a half-wild thing that's just learning to trust again. You be careful how you handle her." Thomas knew Martha was right. In the weeks Clara had been at the ranch, he'd seen glimpses of the trauma she carried. She flinched when voices were raised, positioned herself near exits in every room, and sometimes woke in the night with stifled cries that made his chest ache. But he'd also seen her laugh at one of the ranch hand's stories, watched her eyes light up when she discovered a new book in his collection, observed the gentle confidence she showed with the animals. "She wants to learn to ride properly," Thomas said, asked if I'd teach her. "And I told her we'd start tomorrow." Martha studied his profile. "You know she's half in love with you already, don't you?" Thomas's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "She's grateful, that's all. It's not the same thing, isn't it?" Martha's voice was gentle but knowing. "And what about you, Thomas McKenna? What are your feelings on the matter?" It was a question Thomas had been avoiding for days. Clara Calloway was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. She had a strength that adversity hadn't broken, an intelligence that shone through despite her limited education, and a capacity for kindness that humbled him. When she smiled, really smiled, not the cautious expression she wore around strangers, it transformed her entire face and made him forget how to breathe properly. But she was also young, vulnerable, and dependent on him for everything. From the roof over her head to the clothes on her back, the power imbalance between them was stark, and Thomas was too honorable a man to take advantage of it. "It doesn't matter what I feel," he said finally. "She needs time to figure out who she is when she's not just surviving. She needs to know she has choices." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders came into view, and Thomas recognized them immediately, his neighbors from the adjoining ranch, the Bartlett brothers. They were good men, hard-working and honest, but they'd been asking questions about Clara ever since word of her arrival had spread through the community. "Thomas!" called out Jim Bartlett, the eldest of the 3. "We need to talk." Thomas rose, his expression carefully neutral. "Jim, Sam, Pete, what brings you by?" The brothers dismounted, their faces serious. Pete, the youngest, kept glancing toward the corral where Clara was working with a particularly skittish mare. "It's about the girl," Sam said bluntly. "Word is that she came from Big Jim Morrison's place in Bitter Creek." "And?" Thomas's voice carried a warning edge. "And nothing," Jim said quickly, shooting his brother a sharp look. "It's just that some folks in town are talking, saying things that ain't fit to repeat in mixed company." Thomas felt his jaw clench. He'd expected this. Small communities thrived on gossip, and a beautiful young woman with a questionable past was prime fodder for wagging tongues. "What people say is their business," Thomas said evenly. "What happens on my ranch is mine." "Course it is," Pete agreed, still watching Clara. "It's just, well, she's mighty pretty, and there's going to be speculation about what she's doing here." "She's working," Thomas said flatly, "same as any ranch hand." "Working?" Sam repeated, his tone suggesting he thought the work might involve more than tending horses and mending fences. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop, several degrees. Martha rose from her chair, her hand moving to the rifle she kept propped by the door, a gesture that wasn't lost on the Bartlett brothers. "Sam," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced men recognized as deadly dangerous, "you'll want to choose your next words very carefully." Before Sam could respond, Clara herself appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a bucket of oats for the horses. She took in the tense scene on the porch, with intelligent eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Good afternoon," she said politely, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I hope you gentlemen aren't here about those cattle that wandered onto our land yesterday. I helped drive them back to the fence line this morning." Jim Bartlett removed his hat, his face reddening. "Afternoon, miss, and thank you for that. Saved us a ride." Clara nodded graciously and continued toward the corral, but not before Thomas caught the slight tremor in her hands. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what was being discussed, and it was clearly affecting her more than she wanted to show. "The girl has nothing to prove to anyone," Thomas said once Clara was out of earshot. "And neither do I. You boys are welcome on my land as neighbors and friends, but not as judges." "We didn't come here to judge," Jim said, his tone conciliatory. "We came to warn you. There's talk of sending someone from the territorial government to investigate. Someone's been writing letters claiming you're running some kind of inappropriate establishment." Thomas felt cold fury settle in his stomach. "Who?" "We don't know for sure," Pete said. "But the letters are coming from Bitter Creek. Big Jim Morrison." Thomas should have known the saloon owner wouldn't let $500 walk away without a fight. If he couldn't get Clara back, he'd try to destroy her reputation and Thomas's along with it. "I appreciate the warning," Thomas said finally, "but whatever comes, we'll handle it." After the Bartlett brothers left, Thomas found Clara in the barn, viciously attacking a pile of hay with a pitchfork. Her face was flushed with exertion and anger, and tears of frustration glittered in her eyes. "Clara," she spun around, the pitchfork still in her hands. "I heard what they said, about people talking, about investigations. This is all my fault." "No." Thomas stepped closer, his voice firm. "This is Big Jim Morrison's fault, and it's the fault of small-minded people who have nothing better to do than tear down what they can't understand." "I should leave," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I should have known this would happen. I can't stay here and ruin your reputation, your business. You're not going anywhere." Thomas reached out and gently took the pitchfork from her hands. "Clara, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and Thomas saw in them the same wild panic he'd witnessed that first night in the saloon. "You belong here," he said quietly. "For as long as you want to stay, you belong here. Let them investigate. Let them talk. The truth has a way of rising to the surface." "What if it's not enough?" Clara whispered. "What if they make you choose between your reputation and me?" Thomas reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, his thumb lingering on her skin. "Then I guess they'll learn that some things matter more than reputation." The territorial investigator arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the leaves on the cottonwoods had turned golden and the first frost had kissed the windows of the ranch house. Clara watched from the kitchen window as a thin man in a black suit climbed down from a rented buggy, his pinched face already set in lines of disapproval. "Mr. Augustus Whitmore," Thomas said, reading the calling card the man presented. "I understand you have some questions about my ranch operations." Whitmore's pale eyes swept over the property. With obvious skepticism, "I've received several complaints about the nature of your establishment, Mr. McKenna. Allegations of impropriety, harboring of fallen women, operating outside the bounds of Christian decency. Is that so?" Thomas's voice remained level, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "And who exactly has made these allegations?" "I'm not at liberty to reveal my sources," Whitmore replied primly, "but I have a duty to investigate any reports of moral corruption, particularly when they involve the exploitation of vulnerable young women." Clara felt her stomach clench. Through the window, she could see Martha hanging laundry on the line, her movements sharp with barely contained anger. The other ranch hands had found sudden, urgent business in the far pastures, leaving Thomas to face this inquisition alone. "You're welcome to inspect the property," Thomas said, "though I should mention that Miss Calloway is a guest in my home, not an employee, and she'll be treated with the respect due any lady." Whitmore's thin lips pursed. "We shall see about that." What followed was the most humiliating 2 hours of Clara's life. Whitmore poked through every corner of the house, examined the bunkhouse and barn, questioned Martha and the ranch hands with the persistence of a prosecutor. He made notes in a small leather journal, asked pointed questions about Clara's sleeping arrangements, her duties, her relationship with Thomas. "Miss Calloway," Whitmore said, finally settling across from her in the parlor like a spider preparing to devour a fly. "I understand you were recently employed at a saloon in Bitter Creek." "I served drinks and cleaned tables," Clara said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Nothing more than that?" "No, sir," Whitmore made a note. "And now you're here, living in the home of a wealthy rancher who paid a considerable sum for your services. You can understand how this might appear to concerned citizens." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. McKenna saved me from a situation I didn't choose and couldn't escape. He's treated me with nothing but kindness and respect." "Has he now?" Whitmore's tone suggested he found this difficult to believe. "And what exactly is the nature of your relationship with Mr. McKenna?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Clara was aware of Thomas standing in the doorway, of Martha hovering anxiously in the kitchen, of the weight of expectations and judgments that seemed to press down on her from all sides. "We're friends," she said finally. "Friends." Whitmore wrote something in his journal. "How convenient." After the investigator left, promising to file his report with the territorial authorities, the house felt hollow and cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Clara sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains and trying to make sense of the emotions churning in her chest. Thomas found her there an hour later, settling beside her on the steps without speaking. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch, horses nickering in the pasture, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hoot of an owl claiming its territory. "I lied to him," Clara said finally. "About what?" She turned to look at Thomas, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the gentle intelligence in his brown eyes, the way the fading light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "About us being friends." Thomas went very still. "Clara, I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know I shouldn't. I know it's complicated and dangerous and probably the worst timing in the world, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you, Thomas McKenna, and I think you love me too." Thomas closed his eyes as if her words caused him physical pain. "You don't know what you're saying." "Don't I?" Clara's voice was stronger now, filled with a conviction that surprised them. "Both. I'm not the broken girl you rescued from that saloon anymore. I know my own heart, and I know the difference between gratitude and love. What I feel for you, it's not gratitude. Clara, you're 19 years old. You've been through trauma that would break most people. You think you love me because I represent safety and security, but stop." Clara reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work, the strength that had pulled her from darkness. "Stop telling me what I think and feel. I may be young, but I'm not stupid. I know what love is because my parents had it, and I know what it isn't because I've seen plenty of that too." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Even if you're right, even if what you feel is real, we can't act on it. Not now. Not with investigators breathing down our necks and half the territory convinced you're my mistress. So we let them win." Clara's voice flashed with anger. "We let small-minded people and bitter men like Big Jim Morrison dictate how we live our lives. We wait," Thomas said firmly. "We let the investigation run its course. We let the gossip die down, and we give you time to be sure of your feelings. And what if I don't want to wait? Clara challenged. What if I'm tired of other people making decisions about my life? What if I want to choose for myself for once? Thomas turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. In the fading light, she looked achingly beautiful and heartbreakingly young, and he felt the weight of responsibility for her future like a stone in his chest. Then you'll have to choose to trust me, he said quietly. Trust that I want what's best for you, even if it means waiting. Trust that I care enough about your future to make sure you have one, whatever that future might hold. Clara searched his eyes, looking for some sign of his true feelings. What she saw there made her breath catch. Love, yes, but also fear, determination, and a protective tenderness that made her heart ache. How long? She whispered. Until the investigation is closed. Until you've had time to see something of the world beyond this ranch. Until you're old enough and experienced enough that no one can question your ability to make your own choices. And if I still feel the same way then? Thomas leaned his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. Then we'll see what the future holds. 3 months later, Augustus Whitmore's report cleared Thomas McKenna and the Circle M Ranch of any wrongdoing. The investigator had found no evidence of impropriety, no indication that Clara Calloway was anything other than a young woman who'd been given a chance at a new life. Clara celebrated by applying to the Territorial Teachers College in Cheyenne, using money she'd saved from helping Martha with her extensive correspondence business. She would spend 2 years learning to be a proper teacher, seeing something of the world, becoming the educated, independent woman her mother had always hoped she'd be. The night before she left for Cheyenne, Thomas found her on the porch again, reading one of his books by lamplight. Any regrets? He asked, settling beside her. Clara smiled, and Thomas was struck again by how much she'd changed, how confidence had replaced fear, how hope had replaced desperation. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong and sure of herself in a way that took his breath away. None, she said firmly. I'm going to miss this place, miss you and Martha and the horses. But I'm not afraid anymore, Thomas. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Good, Thomas said, though his voice was rough with emotion. That's how it should be. Clara closed the book and turned to face him. 2 years, she said. I'll be back in 2 years, and then we'll see if you still think I'm too young to know my own heart. Thomas reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle and sure. 2 years, he agreed. And Clara, I'll be waiting.